Good evening. Today is July 12th, 2021, and this is the 59th episode of New Paradigms. I'm your host, Sargis Sangari. My guest today is another trusted friend of mine from the strategic realm, Don Ulsch. Don Ulsch is the founder of China 863, analyst, and also CEO and chief analyst at Phalanx Analytics. He is one of those rare cybersecurity experts who understands not only the technical issues involved in dealing with all manners of cyber threats and risks, but he also has an extraordinary and also profound and I would say visionary understanding of the face and the future of cyber threats. Don is an internationally recognized executive, a speaker, lecturer, cybersecurity analyst, author, and advisor to executive management in industry and also in government, where he's worked with defense, intelligence, and also investigative agencies on technological issues and topics. Don is a guest lecturer on cyber warfare at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and also a research fellow cybersecurity at Woods College of Advanced Studies at Boston College, and also a distinguished fellow of the Phenomena Institute, and was the global cyber threat advisor to the Central Intelligence Agency from 2012 to 2014, the trusted advisor for the U.S. Senate Commission on protecting and also reducing government secrets, and the representative to the Department of U.S. Treasury Cybersecurity Task Force on critical infrastructure. Don has advised the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory, Department of the Homeland Security, DHS, and also the U.S. Air Force regarding cybersecurity threat analysts involving artificial intelligence and mechanical learning and also machine learning at the Department of Homeland Security, and a liaison with them with the CIA. He was also a director of cybercrimes for PricewaterhouseCoopers, where he also led cybercrime investigation in approximately 70 different countries, and also was the vice president of the information security for the Dun and Bradstreet. He was also CEO of 0 Point Risk Research, where he led clients' cyber breach forensic engagements in financial services, technology, and the national defense coordinating communities involving foreign and also domestic actors engaged in everything from most money laundering, nation-state attacks, fake identities, personal data compromise, and also intellectual property, and also prosperity business data compromise. He has written numerous articles, papers, and 2 books, Cyber Threat, How to Manage the Growing Risk of Cyber Attacks, and also Threat, Managing Risk in a Hostile World. Most recently, he co-authored the op-ed on artificial intelligence companies are enabling genocide in China and the Washington Post with the former Department of Homeland Security Secretary Michael Schaefer. It is good to have Don here, I would say. But before we begin, I would like to be able to show a little bit of a video as far as the realm that Don operates in before we invite him in. Don, it's good to have you here, buddy. Much appreciated for the time and the effort. You are an expert, and I would say you're a visionary as far as looking at how cyber threats could be used against us in the future. The complexities of the current war has changed, and the shape has changed. It might not be as sexy as shooting rounds on range, but it is probably the most vulnerable America has ever been. And I'm glad you're here to talk to us about how we can maybe secure it and what is China most specifically doing to be able to counter us on the cyber side.
It's a great pleasure to be here with you, Sargis. I appreciate it.
Don, what is your take? And I know that we recently had some cyber attacks that took place against the U.S. What is your overall take as far as where we are today and how China is using its cyber capability, not just to be able to attack us on the conventional cyber side of the house, but maybe controlling the e-commerce piece?
First of all, my view is that China is our number one adversary, and I say this for a very specific reason, and that is that China possesses an orchestrated infrastructure that is it's almost like a symphony in some ways. It's very orchestrated. It's very coordinated. And virtually every aspect of the society and of the government is moving in the same direction, rowing in the same direction. From the Chinese Communist Party to the Ministry of State Security, the Ministry of Public Security, the Chinese Investment Corporation, other investment vehicles, the People's Liberation Army, everyone is driving to the same conclusion. Everyone has the same agenda. And that agenda is global economic expansion and global economic supremacy. And the pathway to that position is through the acquisition of constantly emerging advanced technology. And that is what we are focused on, what we're dedicated to understanding is the linkage between technology, markets, geopolitical relationships, and China's pursuit of economic supremacy.
You know, Don, I know that in the past I've concentrated on new paradigms on this issue. I had Jason Ho, who had been the lead design for the AI technology on the F-35, and when we looked at how China is using possible backdoors through some of the companies out there, and one of the allegations he made was that there was a flow through TSMC that was sending that technology back into China. Everything you kind of talked about kind of ties that piece in. And I don't know if our viewers understand how critical it is. The chip technology is in the hands of the Chinese as much as possible. I mean, recently I was trying to just get my vehicle to services. I was told you have to wait a month because they were short on vehicles. Even the chips for the keys for those vehicles to come pick up your car. So you have to drive yourself down to the maintenance shop, which is not an issue, but the issue is that you have a delay because the chip technologies that you need just to drive your vehicles and have, you know, a free flow of economy when it comes to American manufacturing, when it comes to at least the competitions on the vehicle side is really being suppressed by China, who's kind of squeezing us into the international market. I know you have some slides for us. I don't know if you want to kind of expand on some of the stuff we just talked about, or we could go into the slides and maybe Dave will define it more as to for our audience as to what you're trying to say.
Yeah, before we get to the slides, I would just like to comment that China is engaged in a tremendous and diversified and extremely powerful mission to acquire new technology. And they're doing it through so many methods. Their plan is actually masterful in terms of the way in which they acquire information, which is both legal and illegal, from cyber espionage to equity investment, mergers and acquisitions. And one of the points that I'd like to make, and this is not really extremely widely known, is that there are actually investment vehicles in China. There are several of them called SSBT Omnibus, ODO5 Omnibus. And basically, these are investment vehicles that go around acquiring equity interest in a number of companies. So one specific example would be this investment vehicle acquiring equity positions in 170 different publicly traded Japanese companies. These are among the largest Japanese companies, from Sony to Mitsubishi to Tokyo Electric Company, Nippon Telephone Telegraph. But China's strategy is very subtle. They keep their equity investments below 5%, so it doesn't really get reported and have to pass regulatory scrutiny. And yet, this is one way that presumably gives them access to what's going on in these corporations from a strategy perspective, a business operations perspective. They get inside information. There are also relationships that they have with other large companies around the world where they are actually involved in international joint ventures and examining and doing research and development in artificial intelligence and advanced telecommunications. And my concern is this: these joint ventures are taking place in a lot of countries. They're taking place in the United States, largely in New York City, Silicon Valley. They're taking place in 2 centers in Canada, several centers throughout Europe. And these same centers are also located, several of them, in China. So there is this whole concept behind research and development and sharing information with these joint venture companies from one country to another. In effect, what it does is it creates a cross-border transfer of technology that is being used to acquire markets, to acquire equity, to acquire geopolitical relationships, and again pursue this economic position of supremacy throughout the globe. So that's a key concern.
No, I know we've talked about this, especially the 5% regulatory requirement, that if you don't meet that threshold, you don't need to have the reporting requirements for it. That's by Japanese law, of course. But, when you think about it, if I can run 5,000 companies, I pretty much can control 90% of what I want within any given company. And China knows how to use the laws in Japan and also the laws against us. I know that a couple of months ago when the POTUS had met with the Japanese Prime Minister, encouraging them to work through TSMC, as we said, which we said that's a backdoor in itself. So it has put us in a position where we're kind of beholden, even at the strategic levels. And I know that you and me have talked about maybe how you can take your strategic vision and what we're doing from our end as far as what we have at the operational levels to kind of see where possibly it is something that maybe legislators can maybe address in the near future. But we'll see. All we could do is kind of point out where we are with these issues. And I think you have a slide decks that are going to kind of explain how we got here, what are the issues that we're dealing with, and then hopefully we'll have some answers for our viewers at the end of it.
Great. Let's do it.
Let's go ahead. Let's go with the first slide.
So our focus is on a group of technologies, 20 nation-building technologies. These are the technologies that China has designated are critical to its competitive position in the global economy. And it identified these technologies in March of 1986 in something that the CCP refers to as Project 863. And it literally was the CCP getting together and making a determination about what technologies are needed. And as a matter of fact, the NSA's former head, General Keith Alexander, said that this cyber espionage, the acquisition of this technology, constitutes the greatest transfer of wealth in history. And we know, for example, that it's cost the United States approximately $5 trillion of lost intellectual property. And when that intellectual property then gets integrated into businesses and produces revenue, what is the loss that represents. These are tremendous numbers. And China has become very expert at acquiring these technologies, again, in legal and illegal ways. I've conducted a number of forensic investigations, both within DoD contractors and in the commercial business. And one of the consistent things that we see in both government and in private industry is the fact that various types of third parties are often involved. And these third parties and fourth parties, which would be the vendors to third-party vendors, are critical relationships. And in the overwhelming majority of cases that I've been involved with, both directly and indirectly, there are third and fourth parties involved. And so this is a very serious problem. And one of the things that China has been very successful in doing is creating lots of partner and third-party relationships around the world, virtually in every region. And so this is a particularly effective strategy that China has. And one of the things that I've focused on, particularly at West Point when I give lectures there, is about the concept of cyber war as economic warfare, and the fact that it is this quest for economic domination by China that really constitutes this next generation of cyber war.
The one thing I would like on that is that people need to understand that the way China uses any type of operation, whether it be cyber war or actual kinetic operations on the ground, it really had to feed within their information operations narrative. So they first build the information operational requirement, and then they build the operations around it. Where we from the U.S. side, sometimes we do the kinetic operations in itself as eaches, and same thing with cyber. So I hope our young men and women at West Point understand that you get to create that informational operational piece and then create your operations around it. And that's how China uses cyber, a little bit more different than we do. And you're right, they do steal a lot of our intellectual property, and once it's stolen, you cannot get it back.
No, we can't get it back, and it's often used against us in competitive positions and in the competitive marketplace. So this is a major issue, and there are things that we can do about it. There are strategies that we can pursue with our allies. There are legislative actions that we can take, but the core problem originated right here on this slide, and that the catalyst for technology transfer has to go back to this gentleman, the Premier, Li Keqiang, who basically stated that our capacity for innovation is not strong, and our weakness in terms of core technology for key fields remains a salient problem. And this has created a large innovation gap. So it's this innovation gap that China has recognized that it's trying to narrow that gap. And it narrows that gap, as I said, through espionage, through equity investment, through merger and acquisition, and through strategic joint ventures. And the one thing about the strategic joint ventures is they don't tend to attract the regulatory concern that, let's say, an outright acquisition of a company might. And so the entire China story, in terms of economic competition, in terms of technology transfer, is really, it originated with that Premier's comments. And it's all about the ability to innovate. So China is able to somewhat narrow that gap through organic measures by developing research centers and universities and pursuing technological development. But that's not enough. It has never been enough. I don't know that if it will ever be enough. But the point is that right now, they are very much reliant on acquiring technology from outside and integrating it into their technological initiatives internally. So China's ability to penetrate virtually every aspect of a nation's economy requires a very broad array of technology, very diversified and expansive array of technology. Now, these 6 areas, these 20 technologies that we talked about in Project 863 are really in 6 different areas. Now, those 6 different areas are information technology. So information technology applies horizontally against the entire spectrum of opportunities across all e-commerce. Advanced materials, biotech and advanced agricultural technology. This is particularly important, biotech and advanced agricultural technology, because China, in addition to exploring all of the other markets that it wants to dominate, has a very strong interest in managing and overtaking and controlling the global food supply. And we did a poll recently on LinkedIn about the global food supply, and I think about 75 or 77% of the respondents on that poll felt that yes, they are concerned about China's ability to manage and control the global food supply, and that's of great concern. So if you look at China's activities there, they have acquired, for example, Smithfield Foods. They are 100% equity owner of Smithfield Foods. They have a joint venture with Tyson Foods, I think probably one of the top 1 or 2 largest food providers in the world. Now, all of these technologies that are being used, they're being used to create a demand for global e-commerce. And China wants to take the technology, it wants to dominate the markets through the utilization of these technologies and to develop an e-commerce program. Now, the space-based strategy is intensely interesting because China is developing a mega satellite constellation, which is going to host a massive deployment of e-commerce. And e-commerce, not just in retail, but business to business, government to industry, and in retail to individuals. So it's going to be a massive undertaking. But China's space-based strategy is taking 13,000 satellites by 2035, and they're going to apply these not only in the development of e-commerce, but they'll use it for communications, they'll use it for Earth observation and navigation as well. And so these satellites will dominate the communication spectrum. Now, what's interesting about this particular issue is that e-commerce is the key to China's economic future. And the key to their economic future is not only the development, but the deployment of e-commerce, an e-commerce platform and e-commerce services into developing nations around the world. And if we can go to the next slide.
If I could hear, Don, before we continue, for those who don't know, I mean, if they go back to our previous shows that we had done on New Paradigms, we kind of laid out how they've already maneuvered their way into a position through companies. Some of them are U.S.-based companies that are really kind of tied and beholden to the Chinese Communist Party. And as you said, look, if I can feed somebody, give them water, give them the electricity they need, or the energy they need to sustain themselves, I control them. So those are the 3 factors that they've maneuvered themselves into, and they've done it at the strategic level, where when we're fighting against insurgents, they would have done it at a local tribal level or even a city level. But it's very important for folks to understand there's a lot of American-based companies that have a lot of links through family relations and ties to the Chinese Communist Party. And I think if you get a chance to do your link analysis, any company that you think might be a company that falls into this e-commerce category, if you just go ahead and Google search and do the link between the parents or between the relatives or the cousins, you'll see how they all go back to ties to the Chinese Communist Party leadership.
And that is in shipping, logistics, transportation, agriculture, energy, oil. It runs the gamut of markets, but also including financial services. So in this particular picture, We're looking at China's financial investment, its economic growth, its geopolitical expansion, and enhanced national security. That's what this is supposed to do. This entire e-commerce program that they are developing using space-based satellites to undeveloped countries. Now, the developing countries are interesting for several reasons. They need an injection of capital. They need to better their economies. They need to create better jobs. They need to improve their educational systems. They need to increase their GDP. Now, what China is doing through this satellite program is going into these underdeveloped countries and basically saying that coming on board with China is going to elevate these countries into the 21st century and supply them with e-commerce capabilities that previously were not accessible for these countries. Now, here's the problem. Many of these countries, many of these undeveloped countries, and there are more than 100 of them that China is targeting, tend to be high-risk countries. They are countries that rank very highly in the Transparency International Corruption Index. So this creates lots of problems for companies. So if we can just have the slide up again, I wanted to point out a couple of things. So if we look over on the right-hand side here, where it says U.S. and allied companies sell advanced technology and goods and services into these e-commerce platforms. Now, this works for U.S. companies. Now, China needs U.S. technology and European technology to integrate into this e-commerce platform. They need these technologies. They need telecommunication technologies. They need artificial intelligence. They need companies that can actually provide goods and services. But the way for U.S. and allied companies to get those services into these developing nations in the future is going to be through a China-owned platform. And so China will call the shots on who gets into that e-commerce network. Now, the lure here is that this is a $1 trillion plus market, and it will be several trillions of dollars in the not terribly distant future. So there's clearly a financial incentive for companies to sell into this e-commerce framework and this platform that China is developing for delivery by satellites. Now, this also creates additional risk for cross-border intellectual property transfer. It creates an accelerated risk for cyber attacks because China is going to be developing many of these nations to become cyber attack proxy nation states. So these nation states will owe a geopolitical allegiance much more so to China than to the United States or our European allies. So that's a problem. So there's an accelerating cyber risk there simply because there are going to be more adversaries partnering and siding with China and secondarily Russia than they are siding with the United States. Now, because of the high level of corruption, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is likely going to be coming into play because there is going to be a lot of opportunity for corruption. So these FCPA violations we're forecasting will increase in the future vis-a-vis investments and the transfer of technology and goods and services into this e-commerce platform for developing nations. Now, the fact that China controls this e-commerce access puts China in a dominant position economically, politically, and even militarily and from an intelligence collection point of view. Each one of these e-commerce outlets becomes an intelligence collection point. And we all know that China is expert in collecting and analyzing technology. And with its artificial intelligence capabilities, it has an extreme capability to identify patterns and to use those patterns against us competitively, both from a military, intelligence, and business perspective.
If I may, on this one, Don, and looking at the map you have there, you have Africa, and you have one of those dots actually sitting at one of the regions that we're focused on. and I know one of them sits on Sudan. For those who need to understand operationally how this works, we have a lot of issues right now with our allies in the region as the U.S. is looking at pulling out of Afghanistan. Of course, Iran's kind of taking over Iraq, returning that piece over. Possibly we might be leaving Syria soon. We've washed our hands of nation building. And China is literally using our intellectual property and our companies to nation build for their strategic plans. And I would say here, as you're looking at it from that perspective, we have a lot of weapon systems that sometimes make it to Sudan, which is a country that has a lot of corruption in it, make it into the Sinai, and sometimes end up even in Gaza Strip that are used against Israel itself. And I think in this case, how would China be using their push maybe in countries like Sudan and other places? If you could give us a kind of a glimpse so people have a better understanding as to, as we're pulling out of the Middle East, we're actually pulling out military-wise from the government perspective, but actually our companies are being pulled in and are having their monies, maybe for the better term, laundered through Chinese processes in order to be able to develop China's long-term plans within the region for themselves.
Yeah, what China is so expert at is taking technology and applying it to solutions and creating solutions that help indigenous populations and indigenous economies. So they've proven very successful of that, just as they are, let's say, in sub-Saharan Africa, where they have 10,000 state-owned enterprises currently operating in sub-Saharan Africa. But the way in which they actually improve that society where they are embedded is through the creation of business opportunities, just like with this e-commerce program. So what they do is they create jobs, they educate local populations, they are involved in bringing technology into agriculture, into business processes. They basically, to look at it from another perspective, they're upgrading that local targeted country, like the Sudan, for example, where they can actually, educate the population. They can create jobs. But many of these jobs are technology-oriented jobs, so they're creating an information technology savvy population when they do that. And every time they do that, information security is always part of that. So they upgrade the technology infrastructure for, let's say, e-commerce activity, but that can also be directed from a cyber attack perspective. So, my view on this, Sargis, is that if they take each one of these countries, let's say there are 100 of them out there, developing nations, they create this e-commerce infrastructure, they educate the population, they create a large cyber attack capability, and they do that times X number of countries. At what point does that upset the cyber security risk management balance of power that exists right now? So, one of the things that I often talk about, including at West Point, is that on any given day, the United States and our allies have the capability to combat a cyber attack. We don't always win, we don't always lose. But what happens when China actually has a larger, more capable attack force multiplied by many nations? Does that upset our ability to successfully defend against these attacks? At what point does the scale tip? Does the balance tip? And we no longer are able to effectively mitigate these cyber attacks. Because I'll tell you, we're not mitigating all of them successfully now. All of these cyber attacks, from ransomware to the theft of intellectual property, cost us a lot of money and a lot of regulatory and reputational risk. And a lot of legal risk as well. So this is a real problem, and we have to, I think, work with our allies to legislate mitigation against many of these actions by China. And so what are these factors and conditions that exist? That this is really at the foot of China now. We look at China's nation-state aggression, their geopolitical investment, blended cyber threats between nation states and other interests, such as transnational organized crime. China then uses that to expand their economy. It creates, additional requirements for regulatory enforcement by U.S. and allied companies. It increases the regulatory reporting that companies have to do, particularly under the Securities Exchange Commission. There's shareholder awareness. How many shareholders are actually aware of these issues? And if they're not aware of it, why aren't they? And are boards of directors aware of this? I think that there's an increase in the level of awareness by many boards, but I can tell you, I have also met with many boards, and a lot of them do not have a good understanding of what it is they can be doing to become more cyber resilient, to be able to combat these types of attacks. And also, what should they be working with their legislators on? What should they be telling their congressional and Senate representatives about the cyber risk? Now, here's one of the problems that we have. There are a lot of corporate interests in China. China has, as I said, they own equity positions in many companies here. They own companies. They're involved in strategic joint ventures with many companies here and throughout the free world. So my position has always been that we're not going to stop doing business with China. But what we need to do is we need to work with government to improve our oversight of how companies are working with China. And we need to make sure that the United States and our allies have a continuing, escalating, and evolving effort to mitigate these risks. And one of the ways in which we do that is by providing oversight, by making sure that our government and our boards of directors and our corporate executives are aware not only of the threat, but the ultimate impact of this threat. Because here's what's happening. China's making a lot of moves across a very large strategic board. They're making these moves in many bold steps and some very small, less observable steps. But the point is, it's almost like it's almost like a glacier. It's moving very slow, but it has tremendous impact. And I don't want to see the day come when we find that we can't really fight effectively against China economically or otherwise because we haven't really prepared for it. And so that's what my concern is. So I think that we need to have an awakening. We need to understand how we can work with China and at the same time reduce our legal, operational, regulatory, reputational, and governance risk of doing business with these Chinese state-owned enterprises. Like I said, we're going to continue to do business. That's just a given fact. But we need to do so in such a way as that we don't empower our chief adversary here, and that we need to control the risk that our U.S. and allied companies and countries will be exposed to.
No, look, you're 100% right. I mean, literally what they're doing, though, they're using our technology and our monies and our companies to be able to do what they're doing at the strategic level. They're literally turning other countries, as you said, proxies against us, and they're able to gain them using the U.S. taxpayer dollars for their own benefits. The Congress can do a lot to curtail this. I think some people in Congress on both sides of the aisle have understood this. It's a matter of what type of legislation can be pushed and whether or not you could educate the companies out there that are going out and just allowing their intellectual property to be stolen. I know individuals personally who have actually been the designers of certain intellectual property who have gone to support China from their companies to maybe manage an issue that they were dealing with, to include on a humanitarian level, and all their intellectual property was stolen. It was just another ruse by China to bring them in order to be able to take their information that they need and use it against us at the strategic level. So look, you can't blame China for doing what it's doing. If we had a populace as large as China was, which if you look at the entire Middle East, where the Near East Center for Strategic Engagement focuses on, there is more Chinese living in China itself, mainland, and entire Middle East has population. So, you got to feed all those individuals in the billions 3 times a day. In itself is not easy. They're taking these steps. Nobody's saying that China cannot expand at the global level, but be as a level partner and that expands. And unfortunately, I don't think the Chinese Communist Party, which is pretty much 80 families that control everything, is willing to share power and is willing to share its vision in support of a global humanitarian issue. I think they're looking at more of what is the best for the Chinese Communist Party collective, which falls into those 80 families. Don, I think
right.
that I think what you laid out is absolutely perfect. Is there anything you have that you want to kind of close out the discussion on what are you seeing as far as what possible legislation that might be out there or could be out there that we could look at that might curtail some of these issues?
First of all, I think that this is the bipartisan issue of our time. I believe this is the most important issue that we're facing because it enables China and its related adversaries to face us down in the global economy, in the global marketplace. So this is something that we absolutely must address, and we must address it now. From a legislative perspective, I think, number one, working with Japan to close that gap on these 170 countries in which China has a substantial equity interest is very concerning. I think that we need to work on that. That's a good starting point because that is a big risk. And I think that that is something that we can address in a major way. We can address it now. We can address it with both parties. We can address it with our allied nations. I think making all of our allied partners understand the significance of this issue and the transfer of technology and how it's being used against Japan's companies as well as the U.S., is critical. So I think we need to work to close that gap. That's one thing. The other gap that we need to close is this cross-border transfer of intellectual property, because while CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, is effective at stopping the direct acquisition of technology companies, I think it's far less effective in the softer, quieter transfer of technology through many of these joint ventures that we're seeing around the world. And I think that is that's sort of the silent problem that we face. We hear a lot about cyber attacks. We don't hear much about the silent transfer of technology and based in companies that are partnering around the world doing R&D and coordinating this research with China. And technology is going across borders into China. So China is closing its innovation gap while we sit by and don't do everything that we should be because we're arguing about other things on Capitol Hill.
No, you're right. I mean, look at the whole issue with the COVID virus. China comes back and says, "Well, you're the guys who actually, funded these programs. So why are you pointing the finger at us?" It's because our lawmakers and individuals that we have in this country never think through the second and third order effects, as we say in the military. And, as much as China's at fault, China has a right to say, you're the ones who funded it. So I think what we need to do, like you said, we got to close the loops on this backside, close those back doors, and ensure that our allies are aware of what's happening within their country, in this case, like Japan, Korea. And then that way, you'll never be able to, defeat the CCP dragon, but you could pull the teeth out of its mouth and keep it more of a viable, capable, partner for the better terms, if you want to call it that, at the international levels. Otherwise, we'll continue to lose our intellectual property, unfortunately, and we'll end up living in a world that even our food will be controlled by the Chinese government. Don is wonderful.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, buddy. Go ahead.
I was just going to say one other thing. What we try and do is we try and look at what is that future state like, e-commerce deployments to developing nations. We try and understand what that future state looks like and then work backwards on what is it that we need to do to prevent that from happening, or to prevent the risks associated with involvement in that program by U.S. And allied countries. And that's what we need to do, and that's what we need to take to Capitol Hill, and to create a level of awareness, a level of understanding about the impact and how that future state is going to endanger the United States, our interests, and our allies.
No, much appreciated, Don, and hopefully Capitol Hill is willing to listen, and maybe we'll come back next week and we'll have much better information for our audience as to whether or not some of the stuff we talked about actually is going to be incorporated in the future in legislation. Don, it's great to have you here. Unfortunately, we're limited on our time. I'm going to have you back again, and to our audiences, please. You saw the information we put up as far as how you can reach Don and go and look at the work he does. Don't hesitate to do so. And we'll see you down the line, and let's do our best to make sure that America remains free and prosperous against what China is doing intellectually against us. With that said,
thank you for your service to our country.
Thank you, Don. God bless, buddy.
God bless.